evening and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Geoffrey Hill. How do you know that you can trust that cop who pulls you over and gives you that ticket? Can you really trust them? There is a huge issue in our society today with trust of the police force and the guy handing you your ticket. Back in 1950s, you know, the days of Andy Griffith on that show with Mayberry, you knew that the cop pulling you over was a man of absolute integrity. There was no malfeasance on his part. But today, there's a problem, and we're going to talk about it. The author of the book, Tarnishing the Badge, is here with me. His name is Jerry Summers. He is a 9-year veteran police chief and knows everything there is to possibly know about how that cop who pulls you over could be good or could be corrupt. Let's talk about it right after this. Whoop!
Ah, yes. Come in.
So I have
Madamania knows what you want. Madamania knows all.
that's great.
You want an audience to watch your short films.
No, actually, I need...
You want to market your successful podcast.
No, I actually just...
You want to live stream video games.
Actually, I want to be able to do it all at once in front of a live audience.
I want to be able to do it all the time. No. You want to be able to do it all at the same time. Okay, I got it. See? Madamania knows the solution.
That commercial with Madamania is one of my all-time favorites. I love how she whacks the guy on the face. Today, my guest is highly charged and absolutely not guilty. He was the police chief. You can trust him, right? That's what we're going to talk about. Welcome to the show, Jerry. Come on out here, shake my hand, have a seat in the hot seat.
Geoffrey, good to meet you.
I'm so glad you're here.
I'm delighted to be here.
So I read your book. It was an incredible eye-opener. It's something that I actually thought, you know, is it really happening in today's world where you just don't know? That guy that leans into your window and says, license and insurance card, please. And then he starts asking you all those extra questions and you say, what does that have to do with the fact that I just was 5 miles over the speed limit? Can you really trust him? And why? What the heck happened?
You know, it's kind of interesting. Law enforcement from the beginning was always, and the badge was always a symbol of the public's trust. Police officers have more authority granted to them by virtue of the badge that they wear on their uniform. And
that's for sure. You see that badge and you start going, you tense up.
And from the very beginning, Sir Robert Peel said, the police are the public and the public are the police. The only thing that differs between the two is that the citizens of the community grant authority to the police officers to take away your liberty. And as a result of that, their expectation of the police are that they're going to act ethically and they're not going to be biased and they're going to enforce the law equally and without prejudice. That's not happening anymore these days.
Why?
It's an interesting phenomenon. I think younger officers and even the top officers in law enforcement now have lost the acknowledgement that that badge is a symbol of trust. Let me put it another way. If I'm going to apply to become a police officer, I have to go through a background investigation, a polygraph investigation, and a psychological investigation.
The lie detector.
Yes.
Okay.
That's all part of the background from the agency that's going to hire me. When that's done, that agency then has to take my background and send it to the Post Academy, which is Peace Officers Standards and Training, and they're the certifying agency. So they get that package, they review it, and they decide whether or not the agency has done a thorough enough background to allow me to go into the Post Academy and become certified under the state. There are certain
So I guess
things that
that's like
prevent
an
you.
attorney's, the attorney board for attorneys. This is for cops.
This is
so
for
when you have to
cops.
pass your test to be an attorney, you still have to pass one to be a cop.
Right, you have to go through the background, you have to go through post, then you have to go through field training before you get certified. Those all are levels. The thing is that
I thought you just went to police academy and like learn how to make funny sounds like in that movie Police Academy.
Yeah.
So there's
Now-
an actual bona fide process. We're not just taking guys off the street, like in the 1870s and saying, hey, I'm going to deputize you, do the sign of the cross, and next thing you know, you're a cop.
it's no longer you're big and tough and stupid, and you get to be a cop because you're big and tough and stupid. It's become much more sophisticated than that. The problem is for instance, there are certain things that will prevent you from getting into the police academy. A DUI, smoking marijuana in the last 3 years, petty theft. Those are all considered the petty theft is moral turpitude.
Those don't stop anyone from being a politician, though.
They don't, but they will stop you from being a police officer. My question to you is why, if you're a police officer and you commit one of those crimes, you're not automatically removed from being a police officer. It'll stop you from going into the academy and getting certified. You won't lose your certification because of that.
But they put him on administrative leave for a
Sometimes.
couple of, sometimes.
Sometimes, not always.
So that guy that pulls you over today, he might had a DUI last night, and the police chief just said, you're my buddy, man. Get back to work.
It's potential. It doesn't happen very often that way, but it is potential. My point, there are certain states in the United States where if you get a DUI, they're not going to do anything until you're convicted. Once you're convicted of the DUI, then automatically you lose your certification for 5 years. That doesn't happen in very many states, but it happens in a few. There are states in the United States where you, as an officer, you can get a DUI, and after your 30-day suspension of your license and you're back to a restricted license, you can then continue working. And my question is, if the general public can't do that, why should a police officer? If a DUI would prevent you from
Really good question.
if the DUI would prevent you from becoming a cop, if you had one in the last 5 years, why, if you are a cop and you get one, you don't lose that certification? And those are the kinds of things that affect the public's trust. In 2011, 2012, I started doing my MBA dissertation, and I recognized that law enforcement was on the cusp of a crisis, and it was a crisis of public trust that was tantamount to the SNL crisis in 2008. So I wrote the book, and I wanted to start getting law enforcement to realize that. As a chief of police, I held my officers to a high
Accountable.
standard, and if they failed, then they didn't stay with us.
It's
not always the case.
as you're saying some of these things, I think of these opportunities where I've been driving along, because we all drive, we're all sitting there experiencing these things, and for a lot of people, the closest thing is that cop with no lights and siren. You're going 65 or whatever the speed limit is on the freeway. The cop suddenly goes right on by you, and you're like, no lights, no siren, scared the living daylights out of me, blew my doors off. I would end up in jail for that. How come he didn't?
There's the philosophy that, there's them and us, and we get to do what we want to. They don't. I can relate to the story you just said. I was driving from Idaho to Washington State, and I was watching cars in Oregon go by me. And they were police cars. They were marked police cars, and they were flying by. And there was a helicopter or a plane in the air, and they were saying, "You've got this coming up." And an officer that was working traffic was saying, "Well, no, that's one of ours." And that's one of ours. And
Oh,
they
like
were okay.
favorites.
And so I'm listening to it going, what kind of image is that giving to the public?
Yeah.
And what was happening is these guys were going to a drug recognition academy,
Going
if
to
you will.
dinner.
No, they were going to a training, but they were running behind. So they were driving 90, 100 miles an hour, knowing that they weren't going to be stopped by the local.
So it's okay
police.
for them to be late to work because they can hit the pedal at 90,
Right.
and we can't.
But
Now,
what
what
was
is to stop them? I mean, how come no one gets caught? I mean, surely in the office they have these internal investigations, and something's got to be done about that.
It's a cultural thing. If your department says it's okay to do that, then you're gonna see that being done all the way down to the street level. If the hierarchy in the department says, no, we're not going to do that, we're going to treat ourselves to a higher standard than we hold the public to, you won't be seeing that with those agencies. For instance, I was driving the speed limit. I was not, okay, maybe I was 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, but that's something that the citizens could do that wouldn't be bothered.
Yeah.
I was not driving.
Everyone
100
knows there's
miles
kind
an
of that
hour.
little moment of that leeway, that gray area.
In the agency that I was both a patrol officer, a detective, and chief of police, I used to have a saying, 9 you're fine and 10 you're mine. So if you were 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, I wouldn't stop you.
9?
At 10 miles an hour, I stopped you.
You just told America that they go
That's-
9 over now.
That is not always the case, and it would happen to be the case in the police department or the city that I was a chief in. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 3 miles an hour.
Yeah, you really never know.
You never know. But there was a certain amount of grace period that we would allow people to be over, because we get busy, we start thinking of other things, we're listening to music, and we just step on the gas a little bit more than we should.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
it happens to me regularly.
But and that's normal. It's when you get to beyond what would be considered acceptable that enforcement occurs.
Yeah,
or
when
should
you're
occur.
passing cars on the freeway that look like they're parked, there's a problem.
There's a
Let's
problem.
keep talking about this right after this. Whew.
Dude, where are the bananas?
Oh, I don't have any.
But how am I supposed to eat pizza without bananas?
Easy. You don't, and then you say that you did.
All right. I'm just gonna sit here and watch you eat pizza. Oh, look at those people. They're so happy and content. Bet they have bananas.
All right. Yep.
Wait, hey, you really don't have to. No, wait, but your keys are right there.
So there's something I've been wondering. You know, at least 50% of the United States says Hillary Clinton should be in jail. And yet, we all know what happened. Epstein didn't kill himself, and she's not in jail. This has got to be the worst case of corruption and what did you, what would you say, the crony where you protect your buddy in the office thing?
A cronyism or
Cronyism.
Somebody's lackey.
Is someone's lackey. We're talking about James Comey.
My personal opinion is that, and it's based on none of the investigation that I ever saw, but on Mr. Comey's press release or press conference that he gave, he clearly said Hillary Clinton violated the law.
Yeah,
and then
I heard that.
And then he went and said no prosecutor would prosecute. That's not his job to determine that. His job was to determine whether or not a crime was committed and then forward it on to the prosecutor, which happened to be the Department of Justice in this instance. And they weren't going to charge him. So they charged her. So they left it up to him to say no prosecutor would do that. That wasn't his place. And my position was that that was the fall of the FBI. It showed that the FBI is indeed corrupt, and we have a two-tiered legal system here in the United States. If you have the money
us,
or the
and
power,
then there's them.
if you have the money or the power or the influence, you're going to get away with a heck of a lot more than if you don't, and that is wrong.
Absolutely true. As you're saying this, I'm thinking, because today we're sitting here watching the news, Trump's being investigated for all of these documents. Well, they investigated her also. So at what point are they going to say, well, he's rich and powerful, whatever?
That's a good question. He doesn't seem to have the same kind of political clout that Miss Clinton had.
Yeah, and that really, really, really bothers me. Whether he's
should.
guilty or not.
It should. The law enforcement's obligation is to enforce the law without prejudice or bias, and without favoritism as well. If you look at the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, it says, one, law enforcement officers are going to hold themselves to a higher standard than they do with the general public. And two, they're going to enforce the law without prejudice, bias, or favoritism. Tell me where Mr. Comey adhered to the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics in his decision that, yes, she broke the law, but nobody will prosecute. It was up for the Department of Justice to say, we're not going to prosecute. It wasn't up to him to say that. That's how the system works.
I just don't have an answer for that, but it is incredibly disturbing.
It is.
Because you can't rely on the FBI at all anymore.
Yeah,
you just don't know.
My argument would be there's a lot of places in the United States you can't rely on local law enforcement either. I mean, I used to say, when I was in law enforcement, I used to say 98 to 99% of the people that were in prison were guilty. Being out of law enforcement now 12 years and working pro bono for cases in which involve police or prosecutorial misconduct, I would say anywhere between 43 and 50% of the people that are in jail are innocent, and they were railroaded.
Holy cow.
That's even up from a couple years ago where I used to say it was 35%. If you look at the statistics now and the amount of Brady violations and
what's a Brady violation?
Brady violation, there's a case called Maryland versus Brady in which the prosecutor and law enforcement are obligated to release exculpatory evidence to the defense. So in other words, if I'm investigating it and you're a witness for me, and I'm going to say, if you'll tell this story, I won't charge you for this drug offense.
Okay, so you make a deal with me.
I'm obligated, and the defense has got the right to know that deal was made for leniency in support of your testimony.
Okay.
A lot of times that's never disclosed. If that's not disclosed, the other person may be convicted based on your testimony, and the jury never knew that your testimony was, in essence, purchased for leniency for your testimony.
Interesting.
That's a critical component. As a juror, if I'm sitting there and I know the person accused is being accused by somebody who's getting off of a crime they committed, that's going to affect how I look at that juror, in other words, the accused.
As a witness whose testimony was purchased by the prosecutor, I'm going to stand up there and lie because it's going to keep me out of jail.
There are cases where people have lied and it's never been disclosed. There are cases where they had leniency and it wasn't discovered until 16 years later that there were leniencies and the jury never knew it. There was a case in California where a woman was convicted of being an associate of an armed robbery, and it didn't get disclosed, that agreement with the person that committed the robbery, naming her, it never got disclosed, that he got leniency for that. She served 16 years in prison before that came out and was reversed, because that was a critical component in the jury making a decision.
So she loses her house, her car, her family,
Her reputation.
16 years for something she never did, all because of that trading, that internal, I can't think of the word.
Well, whether she did it or not, I'm not going to go so far because I don't know the case well enough to know if she did it. The fact is, if you're testifying against me and you're getting paid for that, the jury has the right to know that. There's other cases where the defense asked if any of the witnesses were on government payroll, and they were told no, in which two of the witnesses that testified were undercover ATF officers. Now, I understand why they didn't want to disclose that they were undercover ATF officers, because that risks their safety. But the fact is, if you're asked that had to have been disclosed to the defense. And I'm sure the court would have limited who you or how you identify it. You just would have said some of the witnesses are on the government payroll. That never got disclosed, and when that's a Brady issue. And then when it was disclosed, the conviction was reversed.
Wow.
So we see a lot of that, not a lot of that, but a significant amount of that going on. There's also cases where prosecutors have not opened their records, so the defense doesn't get all the exculpatory. If there was another case in, I believe it was also in California, where the person identified the defendant, saying, that's the person that I saw commit this crime. But when you go back and you look years later at the prosecutor's file, there's a police report in there where that very witness said an hour after the incident they couldn't identify the person. Now that person was convicted and then later was overturned again. Those are the kinds of things that happen when you have a top-down corruption in an organization. And those are the things that shouldn't be happening, because you have innocent people, or people that were convicted based on not all the information. And once you're convicted, the chance to overturn that becomes much more difficult. There's a process called post-conviction appeal. Once you're convicted, you're guilty. The court has already determined, finders of facts have determined you're guilty. You cannot change that unless you have new evidence coming in, okay? Or there's some sort of procedural mistake that was made. So post-conviction relief is not about proving your innocence. It's about proving that the trier of facts
were wrong,
made a mistake in what they allowed into the court, or that there was new evidence, that there was evidence that was not introduced into the court, that had it been introduced at the time and available at the time, most likely would have a material effect on the outcome of the trial. That's a very high standard to overcome once you're convicted.
Particularly because you're sitting in a jail cell.
Well,
it's not like you can just go down and knock on people's doors. Hey, did you really do it?
And nobody cares at that point, really.
Yeah, because as far as they're concerned, you're guilty.
And unless you have enough money to hire the right people, then you're stuck. You're going to serve your time.
This is a disaster.
It's a disaster. Not all officers, not all police departments are that way. But there's enough going on that there needs to be a statewide referendum, which is something I'm working towards, in getting disciplinary actions to become public. Law enforcement right now, if I'm accused of excessive use of force, and they do an internal investigation, and let's say the department determines that I was guilty of excessive use of force, and they choose to do nothing about it, the general public will never know that. What I would like to see is law enforcement.
Because why they won't know?
Because it's a personnel record.
And that's private.
And it's private, and it's exempt.
Because you're leading right to what I was going to ask you next, was how are we supposed to fix this problem?
It's got to be fixed at a state level or a national level, where what I would like to see is that when an agency investigates one of their own, at the end of that, they have to give a summary. Mr. Summers was charged with excessive use of force. After a thorough investigation, the department determined he was not. And then they need to be able to open up some of those records. Now, some of them have to be redacted because there's people that don't need to be, information doesn't need to be released. But the department should have to release that so that the general public knows that their administration are doing the right thing.
So you can trust the admin of department to not just do some secret private deal and
Correct.
cover it all up.
Correct. And the police chiefs, for instance, I said of the officers as a chief of police that I fired, I would have loved to have been able to open up the general public to the general public so they could see I was doing my job.
So you can't actually do that because it's personnel private files.
Right, and it's illegal for me. I'd be violating open record law, and I'd be violating their privacy.
So then the police chief can see that this is happening, and he can just say, well, it's under privacy laws, and you just sort of sweep it off to the side, and it disappears because the guy that's being charged with this, what do you call it, excessive force or whatever,
right,
that they're trying to convict, well, he's his barbecue buddy.
It could be that, or it could be that let's say the chief of police does the right thing and terminates this officer or allows them to resign in lieu of termination.
So since he resigns, he's no longer going to be prosecuted, so he can go get a job somewhere else and repeat the process over and over and over.
Or let's assume it doesn't rise to the level where prosecution normally would occur, but it was excessive, okay? And as a chief, you don't want people that are exercising that kind of badge-heavy approach in your organization. So if you were either going to terminate them or allow them to resign in lieu of termination, there's no process. In Idaho, as a chief of police, I'm obligated to notify the Post Academy, which is the certifying agency, that this person was let go in lieu of termination or resigned in lieu of termination. And I'm supposed to write a form and say, yes, I recommend decertification, or no, I don't. Or I have no opinion at all. Unfortunately, a lot of chiefs are not doing that. And the first argument was, well, we could be sued by our own officers for defamation of character. Well, they now have qualified immunity when they report that to the Post Academies. But they're still not reporting it. So what happens then is you have an officer that in my agency may not be fitting because they're engaged in excessive use of force or some other inappropriate behavior. And I'm going to fire them, so they say, I want to resign, and we say, okay, we'll let you resign. I report it or I don't report it. They go to a neighboring agency and do the exact same thing. And a lot of times that neighboring agency, unless I open my files to them, won't know that this officer had problems. So we're moving a problematic officer from one agency to the next.
I think everyone can relate to this because there's always that person in your company where you work that you're like, how'd they get this job? Were they always like this? I mean, they've been in this industry for 20 years and suddenly they're here. What were they like in the previous 10 jobs? And of course, no one's going to want to show the garbage.
Correct.
So they made a deal. Somebody in the previous job says, I know you really suck, but here, I'm going to give you a good recommendation. Kind of the same thing.
Get rid of you.
Get rid of you, move you out.
Right.
But then they're like, well, we'll get rid of you, but we don't really want you to lose your face and your livelihood. So they just don't tell anybody.
Correct. And
this is horrible.
Unless the other agency comes in and reviews the records in person, they'll never know it.
And you got a bad cop all over again.
And you've just moved one out of your agency into another. And there was a case in Tennessee years and years ago where there were two officers in Tennessee that actually shot an individual. They didn't shoot it. They were known for excessive use of force. And they were let go and they resigned and they went to, I believe, Kentucky and that agency, both of them were working together and got in a shooting. And that agency then found out the previous agency had withheld information that they should have known.
Ooh.
They sued that agency and recovered what they lost in their lawsuit from the previous agency for not disclosing it. We need to see more of that happening.
Lots more transparency.
Lots more transparency.
That would probably make the situation with the FBI right at the top a lot easier for Americans to deal with.
Well, you're starting to see with the FBI now, after years of this, you're starting to see that the public is crying for that transparency. They don't know what the mechanism is in order to have that happen. And the problem is I've talked with state legislators and House of Representative people. Nobody wants to take on the police union or the fraternal order of police in requiring that kind of oversight. And you want
Why wouldn't they, though? I mean, this affects everything. And if you were the politician who says, I've solved the problem,
there's strong lobbies for the police departments and for law enforcement. There are very strong lobbyists. And as a politician, if you take that on and they choose to not support you, then that hurts your ability to move forward. What I'd like to see is a balanced approach in transparency, and that's going to have to come from outside the law enforcement community. The law enforcement community's had over 50 years of self-police, and they haven't done a very good job of it. And you can see that through the writing on the book and through the Brady violations and those kinds of things.
we're talking about this book right here.
Yes.
Right there. Tarnishing the Badge. Can you read that? Yeah, you can read it right there. Or here. There you go. That's actually better. Tarnishing the Badge.
Tarnishing of the badge, yes.
Fascinating.
So
And unbelievably important.
I think so.
I would say so. I mean, it literally affects, some people want to stick their head in the sand, but then you get in your car and you just don't know.
Well,
You could become a victim of this, not even realizing it. Not every cop is bad. I mean, I would assume most are good.
I would say the majority of them
But
are
it's
good, and
roulette
they
now.
work hard. They work hard at what they do. The problem is law enforcement community has not been very good at weeding out the bad apples within their organization. And unfortunately, for a police officer, Boise City had a perfect example of this. They had an officer that hadn't been a police officer for over 20 years. He was eventually charged, and I don't know if he was convicted or not. He was charged with dealing methamphetamine. The Idaho Statesman, which was a local newspaper, said the headline comes out: former Boise police officer charged of dealing methamphetamine. They didn't say, that he had not been in law enforcement for 20 years.
Oh,
They said Boise police officer charged with dealing methamphetamine. If you have that kind of reputation, and it's much like any public office, if you've held a public office and you do something wrong, even if it's years later, it's going to come back with that public office. So that is why the law enforcement community has to be very transparent and very vigilant in making sure
on top of everything
that they're weeding out the bad apples in their organization and they're doing the right thing. Self-policing never works unless you do it right. And if you don't do it right, eventually you're going to have an agency outside of law enforcement community that's going to start to police you. Boise City had that with an ombudsman. And they worked hard to get rid of the ombudsman by doing the right thing. Once they earned the public's trust, the ombudsman went away. If every organization and every administration did the right things, there would be no reason to fight transparency.
It reminds me of a company. If you own a company and you're the owner or you're the CEO of a company, you have to be accountable and do the morally right things. And if you're not, your reputation goes bad, your customers run away. You need a huge PR department because you screwed up so badly. And yet in government, it seems like that's not no one does that. You can just...
They haven't looked at branding and they haven't looked at public image.
Yeah.
And law enforcement is suffering from a branding and public image issue because they haven't done the right things
Like,
over
well,
the years.
we're the Department of Justice. We're the cops. We don't need that stuff. Yeah, you do.
There is some sensitivity, though. In fairness to the police officers, there's a standard in viewing a police officer's actions. It's called a reasonable officer standard.
Okay.
And what that does is if I'm a 2-year officer and I get involved in a shooting, they look at it from a 2-year officer perspective.
Meaning
So
he's
if
only got
another-
2 years of experience as
And
opposed
training.
to some guy who's been doing it for 40.
And so would another officer with 2 years experience react the same way? And if they would, then it falls within the reasonable officer standard.
Okay.
They don't want to compare my actions as a 2-year officer to a 20-year veteran. So they look at the reasonable officer standard. That's what the courts look at. And that's reasonable to do.
It makes sense.
You don't want a citizen group coming in and investigating shootings when they don't know what the police training is and you don't know what those standards are. But on that shooting panel should be officers that understand it and citizens that can also help determine whether or not it was reasonable given what they're told by the officers and the training of those officers. And what we're having happen is we're having only law enforcement review law enforcement. And if they're going to cover your back because you're a law enforcement officer, then the public is not getting what they're paying for.
And it
in
all
their
breaks
law
down.
enforcement. And it all breaks down.
It's like going to your teenager and saying, hey, punish yourself.
Exactly. That's exactly
I mean,
what it
no
is.
parent would think that would be a good thing to do, and yet that's exactly what's happening.
That's what's happening. And it's unfortunate.
And you wrote it here in your book,
Yes.
right there. There's your name at the bottom, right there.
Yep.
Go read it. I read it. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I knew, like that gut feeling, because I don't have access to all that data, that something is up. You watch the news. You see all this stuff going on with Trump and Hillary Clinton. Now she's probably going to come kill me now because we know.
No, you'll have suicide. You'll be dying.
Oh, that's right. I'm going to be suicided because, well, So where can we pick this up?
That's available on Amazon.
We just go there and search Tarnishing of the Badge.
And under my name, Jerry Summers, and you'll find it with no problem.
Yes, definitely. It's a must read if you care anything about your personal freedom. Go read it and become a much more active member of your community to help make this kind of change. Look for transparency. Do your best to, what do you say about that? Do your best to what? Fill in that blank for me.
Do your best to become involved and get your legislators involved in bringing about transparency for law enforcement and anybody who is paid for by taxpayer dollars. My position is anybody whose salary is 50% or more made up of taxpayers' money should be subject to open records law so that the public who's paying for your salary should be able to see whether or not you're behaving appropriately.
Absolutely. And on that note, friends and family at home, I hope you were paying attention. This was riveting for me. I don't know if you could tell. I didn't talk very much, mostly listen. I love it. I love you all. Have a great day.